Thank you, Robin. Welcome everyone, both virtually, as we've been doing for a long time, and here in person at the Side Freedom Library. We're looking forward in the coming days and weeks and months to have people in person. The weather's going to get nicer. We'll be outside. We would like to see your face in a safe way. Of course, the pandemic makes things unpredictable, but we're hoping to do that. In the meantime, we have some other events coming up pretty soon. Before I introduce that, I just want to mention a few things we have coming up. Tomorrow we have an event with Joe Burns, and he will be here with his book, Class Struggle Unionism. So that's tomorrow night at 7. We are going to be hosting an event titled Restorative Justice Archaeology in the Heart of Black Wall Street. So the history of Black Wall Street we talked about 100 years ago. Last year was the century anniversary of that event. So we hope you'll join us for that.
Clarence, I'm sorry to interrupt you, but no one can hear you on the Zoom call.
Get closer to the computer.
Is it just me? Okay. You want to sneak the computer closer. Whatever the wires.
And while we wait for the Eastside Freedom Library to get reset up, I just want to remind everybody, please keep your microphones and videos turned off while we work out some of the bugs, just to cut down on feedback and bandwidth. We'll have some time at the end of the program that you may be able to join in. And please, as it goes along, feel free to put your questions and comments in the chat, and we'll be able to read those out for answers later in the program. Thank you so much, and we appreciate your patience while we work this out.
Thanks for your patience, folks. Thanks for being the guinea pigs. We are glad you're here. Okay, how is this? Can you hear me now?
How is it for everybody? If you want to make sure that you can hear and put that in the chat. We can hear you, Clarence. You're not super loud, but it's better. And people are saying it is better. Thank you so much for letting us know that.
Yeah, do we have enough wire to put it up here? I know we have, okay, we have a, I have one idea. Hold on one.
So while we are waiting for this, I just have a question. If you'd like to share in the chat where you are coming from, we'd love to see what part of the country you are coming from, if you feel comfortable doing that. Thank you. This is great. We've got from all over Minnesota, from Boston, from Miami, from Duluth. We so appreciate New Hampshire, Virginia. This is great. This is why we're testing out this hybrid. Louisville, Mendota Heights. New Hope, Woodbury, Minneapolis. In Duluth, Minnesota, the ancestral contemporary lands of the Ojibwe and Dakota people. Thank you for being here. And from St. Paul, a member of the Minnesota Nurses Association, Palm Springs. Thank you, Jerry. I hope it's warmer there than it is here. And if you check out the chat, Allison has put in a link for more events at MNHS and a link to the book. You may also check out the Subtext Books website, and they will have the book as well. Atlanta, Georgia, Los Angeles.
All right. Am I audible? Can you folks hear okay?
Yes, it's much better, Clarence. Thank you.
Okay. All right. Thanks for everyone's patience. As Robin pointed out, this is an experiment. It's not a total experiment, but there are still things that we're doing because we want to be able to come to you in many ways and in as many venues as possible. This is our first hybrid event. So welcome to the people who are joining us virtually. Welcome to the people who are here. Before I introduce Chad, I wanted to, beyond welcoming people, let them know that there are other things going on. Tomorrow evening, a virtual event, we will have Joe Burns here with his book, Class Struggle Unionism. Following day, on Friday 8th and at noon, will be part of an event titled Restorative Justice Archaeology in the Heart of Black Wall Street on the 101st anniversary, or after the 101st year of the Tulsa riots. And coming up, another event, related event to the issue of unionism is on the 11th. On the book On the Line, a story of class solidarity and two women's epic fight to build the union. It's a book by Daisy Pitkin, who helped organize industrial laundries in the Phoenix area. You can see many of our events at our website, eastsidefreedomlibrary.org. And I hope you will join us. We hope to see you in person as the weather gets nicer. We hope to have events outside on our lawn. And when the weather gets nice, the lawn is quite beautiful. But keep your eye on our website, on our Facebook page, and other social media. So welcome. I want to make sure that everyone knows that there are so many things going on here. And I also want to make sure that people know that Subtext Books is here with us tonight. We will be putting a link in the chat that brings you directly to a way to purchase the book. And I'm sure that we'll be able to provide some signed copies as well to folks who are there. So Matt from Subtext Books is here, and welcome. It's nice to have you in the space again. Now on to our main event. I'm going to say a couple of things about our guest. Yes, we are dealing with a lot of technology today. So the book that we're talking about today crosses a wider discussion that we've been having here at the Eastside Freedom Library. You know, we often see Minnesota as this, well, I guess to use the cliche, this wonderful liberal stronghold that is very accepting and open. The results of the society that we actually live in show something different. The disparities that exist racially along many lines are very apparent. But in the past few years, a lot of discussions we've had and the reading that I've done shows that that our history is much different. And Whiteness in Plain View examines the ways in which residents across Minnesota acted to intimidate, control, and remove and keep African Americans over the course of the 19th and 20th centuries out of our society. And the results of that are showing up. Chad Montrie is a professor of history in the history department at the University of Massachusetts Lowell. He is the author of 4 books, including The Myth of Silent Spring, Rethinking the Origins of American Environmentalism. His article in that very northern city, Recovering Forgotten Struggle for Racial Integration into Duluth, appeared in the summer 2020 issue of the Minnesota History magazine, which is available online. I believe that article, you can get a PDF of that. You can actually link to it from the event page on our website. So that would be worth checking out. We're just going to have a conversation. We're going to start out with Chad, and then the folks here will interact. And I think there will also be some opportunities to do that virtually through the Zoom as well. So with that, I'm going to have Chad come up and we'll proceed. Thank you.
So I'm not going to talk very long. It's not going to be the kind of presentation I'll be doing later in the week, because we decided that could just introduce the book and talk a little bit about the background and some of the things that I cover in different chapters, and then give as much time as we can to a conversation or questions and answers. I could say that in a way this is a launch event, but also a relaunch, because I really began the project Whiteness in Plain View by giving a talk here in 2014. It was years ago, and so many things have happened since then. But that had, I think, been right around the time the Eastside Freedom Library was being established. And so I want to thank the folks at Eastside Freedom Library for that, sort of helping me in the very early part of the project, as well as now in terms of bringing it out to the public. Peter and Clarence, Taylor and Bailey, and all the rest of the staff that have made this event possible, and really made this week possible in terms of how we're beginning it. Also, I want to thank, for the first time publicly, the staff at the Minnesota Historical Society Press, including Laura Weber, who helped me with that article that Clarence just mentioned when she was editor of the magazine there, Josh Leventhal and Ann Regan, who helped me put the book into shape, and Allison Ayton, who is helping me do everything now, and has been really incredible resource in terms of getting talks lined up and getting the book out to public attention. I also want to start by acknowledging the Black Lives Matter movement, because that has done a lot more than just calling attention to racist police violence. It has revealed what many white people wanted to have remain hidden. The fact that racism is a fundamental part of our culture and our politics and our economy. And in that way, it's created a different context for a book like Whiteness in Plain View. I think that I would not be surprised if there's resistance to the book from some white people, if not many white people, given the efforts that are going on right now to stop teaching this kind of history in schools, being masked as opposition to indoctrination or theory, legal theory being taught to preschoolers. What they want is to not have us talk about this part of American history, right? And so that's going to happen. But the Black Lives Matter movement has created a different context, and I think made white readers especially more likely to be receptive than they would have been several years ago. By way of personal introduction, I grew up in Louisville, Kentucky, and in fact grew up in a subdivision called Plainview. And so the title of the book is kind of a play on the name of that subdivision. It's spelled as one word in the subdivision title, but in the book title, obviously it's referring to something else. I grew up in the 1970s there, and it was developed, as a suburb to Louisville, and it was nearly all white. The section I lived in of the subdivision, all white, with the exception of one family who lived across the street from us, the Rice family. And they were very isolated from everyone else on our cul-de-sac and in the surrounding streets. This was a place where everybody knew one another. Many of us went to the same Catholic school together. We were in and out of each other's houses. We played together. We spent summers together. And that was not true of this Black family. And for me, growing up at the time, a young person without much of a racial consciousness, at least until I was 12 or 13 years old, I didn't question the subdivision's whiteness. That wasn't the question for me. I didn't question the disengagement of the white families. That wasn't a question for me. What I questioned at the time was why the Black family was there and why they were so reserved, right? Unfortunately, not too long after I became a teenager, I did encounter a very vibrant activist community in Louisville, and was exposed to the history of racial segregation, not only in Louisville, but in Kentucky and in the South and in other parts of the United States. And I understood a little bit better sort of what was behind my personal experience. I got involved with the Socialist Workers' Party by way of the participation that they had in the anti-apartheid movement. And then I also got involved with the Kentucky Alliance Against Racist and Political Repression. And then by the time I was a college student, I was involved with anti-racist action. So there was definitely a shift in my thinking. And in some ways, I think that laid the groundwork for the kind of book that I could be writing right now. In fact, the activism that I was involved in is very, very much shaped my academic interest and my work. Fortunately, I found very good mentors in college, who were many of them veterans of the 1960s and 1970s social movements. And they demonstrated to me, the ones who were historians or sociologists, the real power of studying history to understand and make change in the present. And so at the time I got to grad school, that's what I was doing. I was being an historian because I was also an activist, right? And what I decided to focus on was labor and environmental history, and the ways in which labor and environmental history could be brought together. I focused in my dissertation and then in other work that followed on how class and race was a part of the origins of the American environmental movement. I finished grad school in 2001, and I did a postdoc year in Memphis. And while I was there, I wrote an article, decided to write an article about a neighborhood near the college where I was teaching, and to try to understand the history of racial exclusion there, the segregation that existed in those neighborhoods, and how that was tied to African Americans' exposure to toxic waste and environmental hazards, right? It was part of like understanding the history behind environmental racism. So that was around 2001, and a decade and a half later, I was feeling like I was coming to the end of this sort of the narrative arc of my research. I was sort of trying to recast, how we understand environmentalism. I had started with a very specific examination looking at opposition to strip mining in Appalachia. And, that was my first book. And by the time we were, in 2013, 2015, I was already, sort of thinking about, like, I had an understanding of sort of how we could tell the general story about the environmental movement. I wrote a book about that, The Myth of Silent Spring. And I was ready to move on. I decided that I would go back to that article on Memphis, that I would think about racial exclusion again. The shift was also prompted at that time by the Black Lives Matter protests that were continuing and intensifying in this case after the police officer Darren Wilson killed Michael Brown. And as because I'm an historian, I was interested in trying to think about not only what's the context for that day, or what's going on that year or a couple of years, but what's the decades of history that might be behind what took place in Ferguson. And as it turns out, in fact, there was a history of racial exclusion in Ferguson, very important history. Well into the early 1970s, communities throughout St. Louis County were all white or very nearly so, with one exception, which was Kinloch, which is just west of Ferguson and adjacent to Ferguson, which was racially mixed, but also because of that had a thriving Black community. What happened, however, was there was an airport expansion in the early 1980s, and residents were displaced. Many of the African Americans who were in Kinloch ended up moving into the already overcrowded apartments in Ferguson. When they did that, whites responded by fleeing. And so you see this really significant demographic shift happen. In 1990, Ferguson was 25% Black. In 2000, Ferguson was 50% Black. By 2010, Ferguson was 2/3 African American. However, white people still continued to run the city. In 2014, when Darren Wilson killed Michael Brown, there was 47 of the 50 police officers were white. And that's not, and besides the fact that the government was in control of white residents or people that didn't even live there. And so what I found, in fact, was that when these two individuals confronted one another on the streets and Darren Wilson killed Michael Brown, that it was also a clash of historical forces at work. It wasn't just two individuals. And when Brown's killing went unpunished, it was not just an individual miscarriage of justice. So that was making me think, along with the other work that I had done on Memphis, that this would be a compelling and worthwhile direction for me to go in terms of my research. I was fortunate to have a conversation with Jim Loewen, the late Jim Loewen, who wrote a book called Sundown Towns, which explains racial exclusion in a national way, right? And I was asking him, how I would, what I could do to begin to investigate this. And I told him one of the things I really wanted to do, although I grew up in Kentucky, I wanted to think about how did racial exclusion happen in the North. I didn't want to do just another look at racial exclusion or segregation with a focus on it as if it was a phenomenon unique to the South. And he suggested that I take a look at Minnesota, which I did. And then I got in touch with Sandy Berman, who lives in Morningside, and also Peter here. And the project began to roll. And I started doing research at the Minnesota Historical Society. And as I pieced the story together over time and across place, it became unequivocal to me that racial exclusion in Minnesota was very significant, that it's not accidental and it's not incidental, but rather very intentional, very widespread, and very persistent. And so I tell this story by going through various chapters of focusing on a city, focusing on a town, focusing on a suburb, surveying the methods that whites used. I also look a lot at how class did or did not affect the way that white racism was manifested. And I look at the ways that African Americans, as well as some white people, resisted racial exclusion and tried to thwart it or tried to change the way things were working. In the latter part of the book, there's a chapter that focuses on the history of Rondo, which is probably familiar to most of the people here in the library, people that are following us online who know something about Minnesota history, which in many ways has a parallel to the Kinloch story. Because by the mid 20th century, the largest portion of African Americans in St. Paul lived in this area, but it's also a racially mixed area, right? And there are a lot of measures of integration in Rondo and the surrounding neighborhoods. People going to the same schools. In the case of the Catholic Church, people going to the same Catholic Church. There's interracial families, and having all at the same time a thriving Black community. But then in the 1950s, there are several urban renewal projects, highway expansion projects that devastated Rondo and the surrounding neighborhoods, causing whites as well as African Americans to be dispersed away from where they were living. Because white people were not facing a racist housing market, they went many, many different places. And I think we have an image for some of the people following us online, a map that shows this. And I don't know if I'll see it, but those who are here in the library won't necessarily see it. But African Americans instead were being concentrated into ever smaller area around the Selby and Dale Street intersection. White people were going outside of Rondo into other parts of St. Paul, some of them to Minneapolis, many of them to the suburbs. And what this does show, of course, because we're talking about federal highway expansion, we're talking about urban renewal projects that are local, state, and federally supported, policy does play a role in how racial exclusion worked. But it also was a matter of white people working outside of the law, or even in some cases contravening law, that were keeping African Americans from moving near them, right? There was in 1948 Supreme Court case, Shelley versus Kramer, which ruled that racial restrictive housing covenants were no longer enforceable. And then in 1953, Minnesota passed a law that banned new racial restrictive covenants. So those are no longer really enforced. Those are no longer going to be useful tools to white people to keep African Americans out. And then in 1961, the state of Minnesota passed its first fair housing legislation, which went into effect in 1962. Has a lot of exceptions to it, but it's a way that that there are people sort of chiseling or that are sort of eroding the legal or other options that white people have to practice discrimination, but white people still do it. They still manage to keep African Americans out of their neighborhoods. Residents were confined to relocation in the fringe areas of the so-called ghetto, NAACP branch president Leonard Carter insisted, by a vicious vice of policy and prejudice. Now, I make this point because of the way that Richard Rothstein's book, Color of Law, has impacted the conversation about racial exclusion. Rothstein has said, he says very explicitly in his book, that he's trying to reframe all segregation as de jure segregation, as a result of state action. And he's doing this because he thinks that'll make the case for reparations stronger, and it will, right? But it is actually really not very good history because I think the emphasis on the government role runs the risk of understating or overlooking the extent to which policy and law actually reflected, sustained, and reinforced popular white will. And it's evolving extra legal exercise, right? So there is policy and law that is involved in racial exclusion, but that is not forcing white people to practice discrimination. White people are demanding this from their government, or they're using the tools that their government allows them, or things that the government doesn't prohibit them. And that is really the center of how racial exclusion functions. And I think it's important for us to recognize this history, this complexity in the history, so that we can better understand actually what the reparations movement needs to address, what its scope should be, how it should be done, not only in Minnesota, but in the United States as a whole. What I'm hoping is that my book, Whiteness in Plain View, can contribute to an historical reckoning. And I think, as we all would agree, that reckoning needs to be a national one. It's not just going to be sort of about the legacy of Southern horrors, as Ida B. Wells once put it, but also about the tragedy in the North. At the end of the introduction to my book, I note, even now, after George Floyd's murder and the public protests it ignited, many readers will be surprised that racial hatred and racial inequality have been such a fundamental part of Minnesota's past. But Whiteness in Plain View reveals the way long-standing assumptions about regional distinctions based on race are off the mark, if not a lie. And that raises fundamental questions about the country as a whole. The ghosts of racial exclusion are all around us. If they are in Minnesota, they are everywhere, wherever we are. So I'll stop there. And if people here in the audience, or I guess people online, want to ask questions or make comments, be, good to get a conversation going. And I don't know how you want to direct it.
Feel free to put your questions in the chat, and Chad will be able to read them.
Or maybe to get up really close.
We're looking.
We'd like to welcome the people here.
Where are the questions? Oh.
Conversation by asking questions. Well, maybe someone wants to start us off.
Anyone here?
I just think it's interesting today. The police officer that killed.
Mm-hmm.
Right?
Mm-hmm.
And and it's evident if it was a black cop that killed a white boy.
Mm-hmm.
They would have got prosecuted, you know.
Taylor.
Reasonable doubt.
Beyond reason.
Yeah. And so, more about what we had. And to me, that's the new, I don't know if it's exclusionary practices
Mhm.
that are held up through policy, right? That are used against us here in Minnesota, and even now the tool around critical race theory,
Mhm.
right? That's being used against us and pushing for policy
Right.
change in Minnesota. That the point that I'm trying to make, I think the book is continuing.
Mhm.
You know, it is it's a shame. I've been here since before. I think really from Detroit, it was like a punk shop. And but the blatant racism is not something that is there. That's going to be organizing
Mhm.
because I know that there's you know to do this. I just want to hear some thoughts about what you thought about today.
Okay.
And any thoughts you have in the critical race theory after you can hear it. So that was my long way to get to that.
So should I, you want me to repeat some
can-
of what was said?
Yes,
Okay.
please. Yes, please summarize.
So Julia, right?
Yeah,
Julia is asking, or starting with a question that for some of you also not here in the Twin Cities or Minnesota today, the news reported that there would be no charges against the police officer who killed Amir Locke. And that was something that happened as a result of using a no-knock warrant. And Julia is also talking about how that there's the history of racial exclusion behind that, but also the way that continues to be part of an ongoing how society functions, right? To continue to maintain sort of racial separation and in the color line in society. And what are my thoughts about that? Since I'm from Louisville, when I was thinking about changing my focus or my research and going to do something with the history of racial exclusion, I thought it might be useful to do a comparative history of Kentucky and Minnesota to show how you might have something similar as well as different happening in one state that's kind of the South and a state that's in the North. And I didn't do that. I decided that it would be probably better in terms of focusing the story, maybe making it more accessible to readers to just do Minnesota. And then in the spring of 2020 and the summer of 2020, I was thinking, okay, well, as I'm revising the introduction, getting this manuscript ready, maybe I should talk about what happened in Louisville to Breonna Taylor, and then also connect it to what was going on in Minneapolis. And I decided I still didn't do that, but that is, this is an ever evolving, continuing, horror show that the book is going to speak to. I mean, I guess, one thing that I found remarkable about that too was that not only, was I someone from Louisville who was writing something about Minnesota, but there wasn't really that much activism happening in Louisville in the spring of 2020. Breonna Taylor was killed before George Floyd. And it was actually George Floyd, when George Floyd was murdered and then the protests happened here, the people opened up a much bigger campaign to investigate finally what the police did in Louisville, right? And that changed what the outcome, right? But now we have today what happened with the decision to not have charges against a police officer killed in Milwaukee. So I don't know if that answers your question.
Yeah, the question was more around critical race theory.
Oh, critical race theory. Oh, yeah. So, yes, I mean, and like I said, I think there's going to be resistance to this because it is the very thing that the people who are talking about critical race theory want to stop from, not just from kids learning, but everyone, right? It's just easy. What they're doing is sort of holding kids hostage in a sense, right? By saying that the people shouldn't be harming children by talking about a certain thing to them. But what they really mean is we shouldn't be talking about this at all, right? And they're trying to stop this history from being revealed. And I just thought, like, as I was getting ready for this, that I take a look at the website for one of the groups that's involved in this campaign against so-called critical race theory, or the so-called campaign against critical race theory. It's a group called No Left Turn in Education. And the woman who founded it, Alana Fishbein, she's very clear about this, that, I mean, in a way that isn't maybe, there's a way in which it's a little more nuanced now, like when Ted Cruz is trying to figure out whether or not kids in preschool are learning critical race theory that he learned at Harvard Law School. But she says, over the years, as my children have been attending public schools, I increasingly noticed that their education was becoming tainted with historical revisionism, political correctness, and the outright rejection of values, which have long been the core of American experience. In June, shortly after the death of George Floyd and the protests, rioting, and looting that ensued, the principal of my children's elementary school issued a message to parents that shocked me. It described a hastily drawn up plan by a cultural proficiency committee at the school to offer explicit lessons on the equity and race for our students. Instead of reaffirming and fostering the wholesome, this is our own words, instead of reaffirming and fostering the wholesome teaching of Martin Luther King Jr., the lessons in this new cultural proficiency unit incorporated specific books to describe whiteness as an entitlement to steal land, garner riches, and get special treatment. That's what my book is about. So she said, I opted my children out of these classes as well. So yes, that's where this book is heading, to the train wreck.
So there was a question from our virtual audience. Maybe this might be helpful to provide some context. For those of us who have not read the book yet, can you share particulars of one place and how exclusion was pursued?
Mm-hmm. Sure. So Rondo is one of those. I try to talk about different ways in which racial exclusion played out. Rondo is an example of public policy being like the main driver of that. I start by looking at Austin in southern Minnesota and the violence that workers used to drive African-American strikebreakers out of town during a railroad strike in the 1920s. And then they also used violence to run another Black family out of town. And after that, Austin is mostly all white, not entirely white, but for the most part, all white. So violence is another tool that whites use. And then I moved from Austin to look at Duluth, where violence is again a part of creating a context where, because the African-American population there had managed to become large enough, and because there are whites that want to stop other whites from practicing a wholesale racial exclusion, African-Americans remain in Duluth even after the lynching that happened in 1920. But what they do in Duluth is draw a color line in terms of jobs and in terms of housing. So African-Americans can only work in some particular occupations, can only live in some parts of the city. And then I look at Edina, and in that case, the racial exclusion is really a matter of racial restrictive covenants. And there's other examples that I use in the different chapters. Bloomington is the last. I look at Bloomington, the last chapter, to look at how white and Black activists were involved in a fair housing campaign and why that didn't quite work out. And so it's not quite sort of looking at how white, it repeats some of the things that whites were doing in other places in Minnesota, but I'm also looking at why white and Black activists weren't able to undo racial exclusion, what it is that they maybe weren't doing to end that history, to reverse the history.
Yeah, I don't know quite how to formulate this as a question, but it also has the Minneapolis example that also connects to the police, but also to the kind of liberal response to evidence of racism. Mm-hmm. And that's the trial of Derek Chauvin. The murder of George Floyd was carried out at the state level by the state of Minnesota. Mm-hmm. And the entire case was built on the premise that Derek Chauvin was an outlier, mm-hmm. that he was violated the moral and ethical principles of the wonderful, socially mm-hmm. responsible police department. And you had not only the chief, but a whole parade of cops, some of whom, it turns out, had some pretty brutal and racist track records of their own.
Mhm.
But I was interested, as, you know, I'm just curious what your response as somebody who's kind of studied the dynamics of racial narrative in Minnesota, how this kind of protective reaction, right? Like as part of this racial reckoning, will
Yep.
focus in on this crime, but by denying that this crime has historical roots.
So do I need to repeat? Are people hearing this?
If you can repeat it.
Okay. So the question is about the reaction to how Derek Chauvin was presented as an outlier in the Minneapolis police force, and not looking enough at the way in which it's embedded in a much larger context and in a longer history. Is that fair?
Well, I would say denying it outright.
Denying it outright.
It's not about-
Yes, and so that's actually why I wanted to bring up the Ferguson and Kinloch example. The Ferguson example of, that is also true of Darren Wilson, right? And when Darren Wilson meets Michael Brown on the street from the Canfield Green apartments, it's not just two individuals that are meeting each other. This was like a long time coming, right? And there's decades and decades of all kinds of things taking place. There's just an enormous pressure, social, political, economic pressures that are meeting one another there. It's like tectonic plates or something, right? And then when Darren Wilson was not even charged, that's like I said, it's not just an individual miscarriage of justice. In this case, Darren Wilson or Derek Chauvin, maybe presented that way, people denying that he's a product of anything. He did get convicted of murder, so it's a little different. But yes, there's a history of racial exclusion behind what took place in Minneapolis, and what is continuing to take place in the Twin Cities and other parts of Minnesota and other parts of the country. And that, yeah, I think that's probably.
Okay, good.
Yeah, so for, as you mentioned, the part of racism being cast as the outlier, do you think that white Minnesotans' perceptions of themselves as blameless and living in utopia, how do you think that, these are great points toward colors, how they perpetrate racism and how they think about it?
It's a very good question. It's something that actually. Oh, sorry. So how does the way that white people think of themselves in Minnesota as sort of lacking like racist history, lacking racism, in a contemporary moment, that how does that factor in the way they react to things? And it is an important part of this story, because there's an historical amnesia, and there's a lot of collective denial that is critical to maintaining racial exclusion. Without that, racial exclusion also can't persist. So uncovering that story is also an important thing to do in terms of trying to end racial exclusion or end the legacy of racial exclusion. And I'm also often fascinated by like how thoroughly people can forget and how much they can forget. And I'm still trying to reckon with that. When I began the project, some people who were doing research in Europe found that there were many, many more labor camps and concentration camps during World War II than they had thought. And I thought, but how could everyone who was living in those towns knew that, right? And yet it took academic historians to investigate it and do research to uncover this or reveal it. But it was revealed already, right? People knew it, they just weren't saying. And so I think that's true in a similar way of what histories we can sort of find in Minnesota, but also other parts of the country. And yeah, so.
Well, I also.
Okay.
So my question is sort of about like late 19th century like immigration and how that sort of changed demographics within Minnesota and across the state.
Mhm.
How those waves of immigration like perhaps don't really know, I guess I'm trying to get your input on this, how that maybe contributed to changing ideas around race, starting in like 1890 to like 1920. I know in Sundown Town's book, that was sort of highlighted as this era of really increased racial tensions, but also the late 19th century had these big waves of immigration, and we look through the census records, we're seeing Romanians and all sorts of things, and they're coming from very homogenous places, also themselves, because they're Eastern European, had some levels of discrimination. And so when I studied these types of things, there was very much a need for them to assert themselves as closer to whiteness and push, others who are not white into very distinct categories. So can you speak a little bit to maybe anything that you found in your research that sort of speaks to that and those attitudes and how immigration impacted that in the state?
So the question is about how does immigration, particularly in the late 19th century, what we I think often call the second wave European immigration, how is that affecting the manifestations of white racism, the way white people might think of themselves as whites, or do immigrants themselves, are they getting incorporated into this category of white? It is very much an important part of the early story of the chapter I tell in chapter 5 on Duluth, right? So the lynching that happened there, for people that don't know this, there was a lynching in the summer of 1920. There was a circus that was in town, and there was a white couple that accused Black circus workers of rape, that these Black circus workers raped a white woman. They were pulled off of the train that was traveling. They were arrested, put in jail, and then a huge crowd formed outside of the jail. Thousands of people in Duluth, and they lynched 3 of the men. And then 2 others were, several others put on trial. And there also were trials of the white people, some white people involved. There was at least 24 white people who were arrested, and then some people put on trial. And those were all, for the most part, with I think maybe a couple of exceptions, working class immigrants, right? They're Scandinavian, they're Finnish, I think, some maybe Swede, Norwegian, and that is not an accident, right? And because there's 5,000 people in the middle of Duluth involved in this lynching, white people involved in this lynching, and they pick these working class kids mostly. And I looked through the trial transcripts, and there's not a lot of evidence that they necessarily were the main organizers of the lynching, or even maybe were even involved in the lynching. And they were convicted. The ones that were convicted of riot, and a few went to prison. I think a lot of people that were involved just got off because they were protected by not being immigrants and by not being working class. And we were talking about this earlier, that there's a picture of this lynching. It's very gruesome, and it's in the book, and I'm not going to show it, but you can see it in the book if you get a copy. And that picture was famous because it was shown by a photographer in Superior, Wisconsin, and he was arrested for showing it because it's considered to be obscene. But people are trading this picture around, and so everybody knew the main organizers of the lynching are there. They're standing around these men who are dead, and people knew who they were, right? And they didn't get tried, and they're probably people that know who they are now, and nobody's saying their name. And I think that maybe that would also be, that's an example of what we were talking about just a few minutes ago, but that yes, we need to think about, the bigger sort of, there's an historical background to Derek Chauvin killing George Floyd, but also it's important to know the individual names of people, so they're not just a mob, right? That we don't make this just a story that's like that almost like is about something abstract, that there were real individual white people that are involved in these things like a lynching, or involved in keeping African Americans out of their neighborhoods. And I want to know that too, right? In addition to the bigger, larger narrative that I'm trying to craft. That kind of gets away from your original question.
Yeah, but just the kind of correlation between that, like you said, kind of then, the next big target is some of those fuel that racial tension and divide.
Yeah,
That
yeah, well, it lets white middle class people off the hook, right? They got to say Carl Hammonberg, who's this, kind of like, unstable white kid with a single mother, single parent, his dad's in prison, he was a rowdy, and meanwhile, the people, the upstanding members of society, they would never do this. So they don't implicate, they unimplicate themselves by pinning it on immigrant working class residents rather than everyone, right? The thousands of people that were there in town.
Yeah, so I was wondering if in your work you started to notice a pattern or a playbook, if you will, that cities resorted to, whether it was something that was applied to indigenous during the Indian Wars, or the Jillian mentioned immigrants, or were there any kind of indicators of tactics that had worked for cities to address these, or were they all sort of kind of ad hoc ways of limiting exclusion?
You want to do that, and then there was another question that maybe piggyback on that, talking about racial exclusion as a factor in Japanese Americans' inability to find housing. They're trying to settle in Minnesota from camps. So you brought in the indigenous population, but so like, is there something common in that practice of racial exclusion that we see most evidently with African?
Right. So do you want me to repeat what you just said too?
Repeat as much as you
Okay.
can.
Okay. So there's a question about, are there similarities across the way that white people practice racial exclusion against, I think, African Americans, but also against other groups who are not white in not only Minnesota, but other parts of the country?
Sure, just similarities you may have picked up on as tactics.
Right. And this was something that started to strike me early on in the project, was how white people knew how to do this. It was like there was a manual that somebody published, and they all read it, and they all knew what to do. Because a lot of times, as I said, this is not about policy or law that they're using. They're not using tools that the government has given them, and they explain this is why African Americans, or this is how African Americans are kept out of their neighborhoods. There are ways in which the federal government, state government, local government is involved, but there's also things that white people do that are kind of like surreptitious, right? Like realtors know how to show houses and not show houses, and white people know that realtors are going to do this, and neighbors know how to collude with one another to stop people from looking at apartments or homes. And it is uncanny how, from community to community, without email, without any kind of like connections that we have now, that they all do the exact same thing. There is some story behind this. The realtors are having conferences and conventions, and so they do talk to one another. But that still, in a way, is like, I'm still fascinated with this, like how it is that white people can do the exact same thing from community to community for a long period of time. I do think there's different ways in which racial exclusion happens to groups. White people have different relationships with African Americans, with Native Americans, with Japanese Americans, and they each have their different history. So they're not, I think there's ways in which those stories overlap, and they're related and they're important, but they're not the same. I do start the book in the first chapter by talking about the 19th century and leading up to the US-Dakota War of 1862, which led to the largest mass execution in United States history of Dakota, who were tried and convicted and sentenced to death. And then that also was paired with exclusion of Dakota people and Ho-Chunk people. And that is, for me, what I think of as sort of the first wholesale racial exclusion in the state of Minnesota. And I tell that story partly because it's important in its own right, but it is also the foundation for the white white exclusion of African Americans or attempts to exclude African Americans in the wake of the Civil War, which is happening at the very same time, right? And how white people are feeling and ways of sort of being driven to defend white supremacy, right? In the wake of the US Dakota War and then the Civil War and post-emancipation, possible post-emancipation migration of African Americans to the North, including Minnesota. So there's a way in which those two, the histories of the two groups of people are connected, but not the same. And if you look, you know, falling far forward in time into the 21st century, racial disparities are not the same, right? Different groups have different experiences now in terms of healthcare, in terms of education, in terms of incarceration, and in terms of where people live or don't live.
Yeah. Here is, well, does anyone? Yeah, man.
I was hoping you could talk a little bit more about what you're saying about Ross Pete's code of law and how you use all that different cultures in here, or how it informs such a thing. He doesn't really talk about Minneapolis or Minnesota very much in that book, but as I was reading it, it felt like he was always still talking about. I knew that that was there. It feels like this fills that gap a little bit more. So I'm just curious
Yeah.
about that.
So let's see, that book came out in what, 2018, I think, maybe something like that. That's after 2 decades of people, at least 3, maybe more, writing about what he's writing about, right? But for some reason, people believe that he discovered this topic and did not. And he doesn't really give it credit to the other historians who have done the work of uncovering this history. And because he's very interested in trying to be part of a policy conversation, he does this thing where he emphasizes segregation as being de jure, not only in the South, but also in the North. And it's just bad history, because there are ways in which law and policy are a very important part of the patterns of segregation that we see in the North, including in the state of Minnesota. But he overemphasizes that. And in doing that, he is misrepresenting the way that racism works in American society, which is, as I said, more often white people demanding from their government that they have tools. And then when they don't have those tools anymore, they find something else, right? So when Shelley versus Kramer ruling came down and restrictive housing covenants were no longer enforceable, that doesn't end racial exclusion. White people in the suburbs are expanding more after the Shelley case in 1948 than they were before, white, and all those suburbs go white. And they didn't need racial restrictive covenants to do that. They have the other tools to do it. And so it's disingenuous what he's doing, but it's also dangerous because, like I said, if we're gonna have, we need a sophisticated understanding of this to have a reparations movement that addresses what is really wrong and to figure out what it is that needs repaired. And that's just oversimplifying something in a way that could, I think, misguide us, right, in that respect. But does that answer your question?
Yeah, it does. I was just intrigued by what you mentioned.
Yeah. Here's something from a bit close so people can hear. Something from Greg Pofferl. I'll read what he wrote. I attended your presentation in the Marion Park Library in St. Paul on May 7th, 2014. So he remembers the exact date. Greg has that kind of mind. But also you were talking about this earlier, about sort of how you started writing this book. You asked a student of mine, Greg's, who was researching the Arthur and Edith Lee story and redlining and racism in Minneapolis to co-present with you. It was a very special event for her. She went on to win first place in the National History Day competition and went on to the national competition at the University of Minnesota Duluth. At the time, you were working on Whiteness in Plain View and was trying to put together, oops, I'm sorry, I just lost part of that. I think you get the gist. Sorry, Greg, I will finish this in a second.
He's going with it,
yeah. I mean, that sort of talks about the kind of people that we hang out with here at the library and the resources that people are willing to give, not just to the public in general, but but to young people especially who are doing great work.
I
Yes.
remember that student. I was astounded by what she was doing, and so I'm not surprised that she won first place. At the time, yeah, I was trying to sort of figure out how this would come together as a documentary film. And what I realized, and maybe this speaks to a few things that we've covered in the Q&A here, is that at least me personally, I think maybe other people could do this perhaps better, but trying to tell this larger story that happens across the state of Minnesota was just really too difficult in a documentary film. And so I retreated back to what I knew, which was to write a book. However, one of the people that you maybe, I don't know if people in the online can see our audience, but one of the people in the audience is James Curry, and he's working on a documentary about his family that includes the story of Hastings. I think that maybe is a much more manageable way to approach this, is to think about it in terms of a family story or a local community story. But I don't really think I could have pulled off. I'm glad I decided not to try to make the documentary about the whole state, and instead we have this book that maybe can be useful to people like James and others who want to focus on other media or more local narratives. But congratulations to that student. I'm glad. And I did talk to some Edina students recently too, and I will be speaking in Edina twice on Friday, and I know there's a lot going on there in terms of student activism because of things that are taking place. And so I'm looking forward to talking to more students, hopefully there.
William. Okay. And I don't have a question. I have all these things that I wrote down. Wow. Like this is new, a light bulb, right? Like somehow we didn't know there was alcohol being served. Like we didn't realize that America is built on a white supremacy ideology. That's what whiteness. You said that once. The point of it all, what I always ask. I live in 2022. This is the 21st century, not the 19th, not the 20th or the 17th. The point of it. I also wrote America is complex, the complexity of America, right? Two things can be true at the same time, and they could be diametrically opposed. January 6th didn't just happen. In America. It just pop up. Donald Trump wasn't elected. Don's in the president. Everything in America was intentional. And it still is intentional. The point of it all, are we trying to eradicate racism in America? It's going to be hard. But America is a racialized nation. And race, only in America, you said this, only in America does race matter. Only in America. As a matter of fact, Americans have defined it with science. Right? I ain't black. Anybody want to challenge me on that? Go right ahead. I ain't. I won't subscribe to it. I am a person that has a descendancy of Africa. Period. I'm an American. Born in Chicago. Hey, Minnesota is 83% white. Get over it. You want to do something? Stop buying into the white. This ain't my
Mhm.
Hey,
So I don't,
Anyway.
I don't think I can summarize all of that, but I think on maybe this last point that you made especially important, that in many ways this book is for white people because they're more likely to not know what's in this book. Other people will know, or they'll know parts of it. And I understand that. And I think it's an obligation that I have as a white academic, as a white historian, that I work in the archives and that I bring this to people, do what I can to make a case against white supremacy if that is, you know, if it plays a role in that, that's, you know, what I hope for. But yes, also to say something that William just said in the audience here, like, I'm not sure how much it's going to make a difference. The more I worked on this book, the more I sometimes wondered if this will just be the undoing of this country, because it just seems so deeply rooted. And including this idea, this question of, do people even know it? Do people even remember it? And the work that they put into not knowing it, the work they put into not remembering it, it's really kind of unsettling to think of. Yeah.
This white will and government, not just government, but white will,
Mhm.
one of the same.
Right. Yeah. Right. Who's the government isn't just an institution, right? It's like people in the government.
It was this one last thing, and I'll shut up. Let's see. America didn't begin in 1619. America began in 1776. I just want you to realize that, right? Anyway, that's significant, I think. That's all.
But Ricardo, you had.
Yeah, you talked about the fallacy of putting too much emphasis on law. And you talked a lot about the way in which racism is embedded in white culture. And what I haven't heard much about is classical economics. It's like the presence of the need under capitalism for a permanent, which is to say, racially based underclass, which really seems to be the underpinning in terms of vested interest for both white cultural pathology and legal structures to keep reinforcing that.
Right.
Or in the case of white folks, to keep reaping the benefits.
Right.
So I'm hearing the silence where that discussion of class and money should be.
So the question is, what about class, and how does that play into how racial exclusion happens, and to what extent is racial exclusion about the needs of class exploitation, or how racial exclusion or in racism overlaps with class exploitation? That
Or
If
just,
we were to do it, we will.
Yeah, or the phrase, you know, a race-based underclass.
Yeah.
We've established a
structural reality.
race-based underclass. Yeah, that.
So, I mean, just in one way, what I realize in doing this and looking at different people across communities and across time is that racial exclusion does happen differently if we look at class. And so in Austin, it's white workers who are doing the violence that drive Black strikebreakers out of town and drive another Black family out of town. It's white working class people get blamed for the violence in Duluth. It's less often middle class or professional or upper class whites that use violence. They have other tools. So they use different tools if they're from a different class, but they do this, they have the same end, right? And if you look at the demographics, the results are pretty much the same. And there's a way in which, I mean, I started out as an historian thinking that, you know, that class explained American history. And the more that I got into this project, as you know, over the last couple of decades, I think I was realizing this, but especially this project has made me wonder about that. And is America, is race actually more fundamental than class? Which is not to say that class doesn't matter to race, right? I mean, like you said, that there's a way in which race is functioning as a categorization of people in order to maintain a certain group of people in an economic class, right? Whether it's racialized slavery or racialized labor market segmentation, you know, in a capitalist, industrial capitalist economy. But in terms of racial exclusion, it's interesting how class shows up, but also how interesting how class disappears when we're talking about white racism.
There is a question from our virtual audience that so you were talking about there are different tools that people use to sort of enforce this racialized society. And they change over time, just like in real estate, you know, you had the mobs, and then you had restrictive covenants, and you had redlining, and then you had the real estate practices and lending practices. But message here, I think some people think of blatant racial exclusion as something that only happened long ago. Are there recent, since the 80s or even the 2000s, that are examples of this kind of behavior? Did you get a chance to look at something like that, or is there or good illustrations of
Right.
that?
Well, I end the book with an epilogue that looks at what has changed or not changed about residential patterns in Minnesota in the different communities I look at. And in some cases there is change, in some cases they're not. Overwhelmingly, you're still seeing of a legacy of racial exclusion, which I think also is seeing people engaging in practices of racial exclusion today. And these are, again, they're sort of like outside of the law. And so that is, I guess that's another reason why I want to make this case that we need to think of racial exclusion as happening because of this white will and interest. And it's something that can happen without it being very evident, right? To at least, I mean, it's evident to the people that are experiencing it, but there's a way in which it's not like so public, and it's not like, you know, the racial restrictive covenants were very clear. They're written down. You can see it. You can watch a state court enforce it or not enforce it. But the way that residential patterns are maintained now in terms of racial exclusion are a lot more like what people were doing back in the 1950s and 60s, again, outside of the law or contravening the law, and they're not necessarily talking about it, right? Or it's not necessarily getting in the news. And this is actually a thing that we didn't talk about tonight, but it is in the book. And despite all of the help that I got from Jim Lowen about, you know, how to do this project, I'm also going to question this sundown town concept. And I think that also simplifies the way racial exclusion work. People saying that Black people don't go into a town because there's a sign or police stop them, or there's a water tower siren that tells them they have to get out of town. And that's just, I mean, maybe that happened, and we don't have any pictures of signs. We don't have any old signs. We don't have any evidence that anybody said, you know, this is when you turn the siren on and this is what the siren means. It doesn't mean that those signs didn't exist. It doesn't mean that the sirens weren't understood for that's what happened, but we have plenty of evidence of all kinds of other ways that white people practice racial exclusion. And focusing on sundown towns, which everybody will use that phrase to describe racial exclusion now when they talk about it, because a lot of people have read this book, it misses what really happened, right? And missing what really happened means we're not in a good position to figure out how to undo it, right? And so I think, you know, again, like, I respect Jim Lowen and his work a great deal. His Sundown Town book is national in scope. It took a Herculean amount of labor to do, but it has put us in a place where we are operating with a erroneous way of understanding how racial exclusion happens, at least in the state of Minnesota. Julia?
I just want to talk a little bit about Sundown Town stories passed on generations. So even though there's not the physical evidence,
Right.
it's the historic evidence of what happened to Black people.
Yep.
When you go into these towns. Right? So there were people who were diligent about mapping out sundown town.
Right.
And you had maps of towns to avoid or get out before the sun came down, right? So maybe it wasn't advertised in a lot of towns in that kind of way. Maybe that stuff I take it down with it. But it's true based on the historic storytelling, which we are as Black people are getting used to telling
Mhm.
about what happened. Those travel from the south
Mhm.
to the north,
Right.
right? So sundown town, I believe, is, when you talk about evidence,
Mhm.
I think, the narrative, historical narrative, so
Right.
you talk to folks, and they said to him,
Mhm.
this is what happened.
Right.
I believe that, and I know my family, who's from Durant, Mississippi, right? I heard that
Right.
from my
Right.
family about something.
Right. And so Julia is saying that there's an historical memory that's being passed from generation to generation about a sundown town or what was a sundown town. And I think that that could be part of what's going on is that if people remember a sundown town, that they also might be remembering a town that practiced racial exclusion in all these other ways. And it's just been sort of then sort of retold as being about a sign, right? But there was a lot else going on. But we do have, and this is, I think, something I wanted to look into more that I didn't do in the book, that it could be another project, which is it's to investigate that, right? And I think what you're referring to, Julia, is the green book, which is sort of the manual that you would have in order to go to find a safe place to stay, right? Or a place you can get gasoline to fuel your car, or a restaurant you can eat at. But there are people that remember, say, Austin, Minnesota, as being a sundown town, and that there were signs and blacks run out of town by the sheriff, and it's in the green book. The Fox Hotel is in the green book. So why is there a hotel that is accommodating African Americans in the middle of town in supposedly what was a sundown town, right? And so that makes me wonder about these memories, right? And there's another example of this, which is sort of a little bit of an opposite, but there are, like, when I have my students do projects about the Vietnam War and they interview people, there's so many veterans that remember that activists spit on them as they got off the plane and went into town. And there's a Vietnam veteran named Jerry Lemke, who's a historical sociologist. He did a book on this called The Spitting Image, and he found that just didn't really happen. Like the evidence he has that people spit on someone else during the Vietnam War, it was pro-war demonstrators spitting on anti-war activists. That activists were actually quite involved in supporting Vietnam veterans, and people invented the story about activists spitting on veterans as a way to separate them off and say soldiers weren't anti-war, or anti-war activists weren't significantly engaged with the experiences of soldiers. And I'm not saying that that's exactly the same what's going on here, but it does make me question anecdotal evidence and people remembering, oh, this was what happened, which would be more compelling if we had other evidence. But we don't have any of these signs. We don't have pictures of the signs. We don't have any newspaper reports of the signs or anything like that. Well, I need something. I have to have evidence to,
It is real.
Yeah.
I grew up in Chicago,
Mhm.
Illinois. In the 70s, I was born in 58. I was running around in the 70s.
Mhm.
Cicero. They told me not to go in Cicero
Right.
after dark.
But have you ever seen it? Was there a sign? Yeah.
A sign?
Yeah.
I don't know.
But people,
sign.
but people remember the signs.
No, no,
That's-
no,
that's
no,
what-
yeah, it had nothing.
Yeah.
No, it's about, see, because one of the things you talk about is this will.
Mhm.
Well, the white will, that's part of it.
Yeah. But there's a
In neighborhoods.
Yeah.
That said, when Martin King went up north, he said it was the most dangerous place he has
Right.
ever been.
right, and he got attacked.
Right.
Yeah. And there's
Because
kids.
of the will of white folk.
Right. And in the oral history collection of people growing up in Rondo, people talk about, there's kids that remember, for instance, going trick-or-treating and they cross the street into another neighborhood and the white people come out and say, we're calling the police because you're in the wrong neighborhood. And if they go back across that street, everyone knows what the boundaries are for where they can be or not be. And so in that way, what you're talking about, that's similar to Chicago, Illinois, or parts of Chicago, Illinois. But I think what we're talking about is, if you look at Jim Lowen's website, there's town after town after town where people say, I saw a sign. That's what they're saying. So
It sounds like what you're saying, and what William is saying too, is maybe there was a sign and maybe there wasn't. We'll believe the people, but the fact of the matter is that you don't really need a sign.
right, there was racial exclusion.
You're not supposed to be here after dark or here at all.
Yeah.
So, I mean, we don't have a lot of time left. Just there's one thing, there are a lot of questions we can't get to that, and thanks for folks who are posting things in the virtual chat. Sorry, we can't get to everything, but there's one thing, maybe. You talked about Austin, you talked about Duluth. I grew up in St. Cloud. I know Chris Lehman talks about St. Cloud. He wrote an article for the Historical Society magazine like you did. What is it about Minnesota, in those three towns in particular, but elsewhere as well? What is it about Minnesota that makes racial exclusion so strong? Why is it so strong? And it plays out in the disparities that we see here.
Yeah.
What is it about Minnesota?
And you can't forget about Oregon.
Yeah, well, okay.
I'm not sure that, I mean, you know, I didn't study in other states, so I can't say this for sure, but I'm not saying that Minnesota is exceptional. What I want to suggest is that Minnesota is an example of what's going on in the rest of the country. And the whiteness of Minnesota, which people might think is just some accident, and therefore it's an outlier, and we don't even need to study it, is actually a result of the same things that are going on in other parts of the United States. And therefore, if it happens in Minnesota, then we need to be looking for it elsewhere too. And that we need to be talking about this as not just a Southern phenomenon, but a Northern one, not just something that's happening in one state or another, or one region or another, but across the country. And that's same also with communities, right? I'm gonna go to Edina on Friday, as I said, and speak there. And people, you know, I know this is a thing to put down Edina, but Edina is not unusual. Like people, there's no one really in the state of Minnesota that can say that their community is really that different from Edina in terms of the racial exclusion that happened there. In fact, what makes Edina exceptional is that it was a fairly well-established interracial farming village for a few decades, in which you had real cultural, political integration of Black families, and then it went all white, right? And not all communities had that.
Yeah, it is coming up on 8:30. I am grateful for everyone who joined us here at the library. Grateful for everyone who joined us virtually. We had over 80 participants in this event. It's been a long evening, kind of like the ones we had when we were always in person. But I just want to thank everyone. I want to thank everyone for their presence as we deal with the technology and figuring this out. This is the first time we've done this. We will do it again. I want to make sure that people know that Subtext Books, who is here with us today, has the book for sale. You can get signed copies from the store, mailed out or in the store. The link is in the chat. If you have any questions about that, contact either Subtext Books or the library, and we can make sure that you can get what you need. And again, I hope you will join us again soon. Thank you, Chad.
Thank you.
Thank you, everyone here.
Yeah. All right. Thanks to
Let's do
everybody
this again.
here at the library again for putting this together. Thank you so much.
Thank you.
And for the audience coming. Thank you. All right, you handled that well, calm and collected.
Thank you, everybody, for being here tonight. We hope to see you at another program soon. Good night, stay well, and watch for more programs. And thank you to the Eastside Freedom Library and the University of Minnesota, excuse me, the Minnesota Historical Society Press.